In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. The first words of the Bible. Clearly not a scientific statement, and never intended as one. But as a symbolic statement, it's not so far wrong, because the appearance of civilized man does seem to have taken place with the suddenness of a sunrise. The evolution of this figure, whom we know from skulls, with low forehead and crunching jaws, who came out of his cave to hunt and eat, into this man living in a shining hall with geometrical proportions and recording the passage of time in beautiful hieroglyphics. This process, which by evolutionary standards should have taken millions of years, seems to have taken only a few hundred. Where did it happen? Historians give contradictory answers, as one archaeological discovery cancels out the other. But from ancient times, people have believed that it happened in Egypt. When did it happen? There we can give a clearer answer, because most people believe that civilization first appeared about 5,000 years ago, both in the Nile Valley and in Mesopotamia. The cities of Mesopotamia rose and fell, but Egypt remained a social unit for almost 3,000 years. How did it happen? Well, I've come out here to describe some of the stages in this almost incredible event. What happened in the beginning? We find the answer in the earliest Egyptian art. From about the year 2800 BC, it reveals nearly all the qualities that we value in civilization. A sense of beauty and of the dignity of man. A well-organized government run by responsible men. A belief that man could be inspired by the gods. An awareness of nature as something very close to ourselves, which could be beautiful as well as useful. A sense of clarity and order. Geometry and its application to design in sculpture and architecture. All these qualities appear in Egypt 1,000 years before they appear anywhere else. What made possible this miraculous development? Well, for once the answer is simple. The river Nile. The country has virtually no rainfall. The greater part is desert, but the heavy rains in distant Ethiopia caused the Nile to flood every summer. In the autumn, the floods receded and the land, flooded with absolute regularity, was extremely fertile. It and it alone supported life. It was Egypt. All around stretched the barren desert. Pouring northwards over the cataracts of the Nubian hills, the Nile floods brought with them silt, a rich deposit of fresh earth which was left behind every year when the floods went down. The Greek historian Herodotus rightly said, Egypt was the gift of the Nile. Very early, the Egyptians learned how to profit from this unique situation. They lived mainly on the desert shelf and came down to collect water. They built canals, dug wells, constructed water wheels, cultivated and herded. Living in a climate of almost unvarying good weather, dependent on a regular and, as they supposed, God-given natural event, they became adept at its conservation and, in consequence, intensely conservative. The Nile ran from south to north, so that the sun made a complete arc over it. The sun rose in the east, and it was on the east bank that they built their cities. It died in the west, and it was on the west bank that they buried their dead. Light, the sun, water were life. Darkness and the desert were death. They worshipped the sun under various titles. They thought that it died every night and was reborn. They believed in the immortality of the soul and the resurrection of the body. They believed that good deeds would be rewarded in afterlife. What a leap forward of the human mind from the days of voodoo and human sacrifice. Politically, the crucial step was taken in about 3000 BC. The separate Stone Age communities along the Nile were welded together by a warlike king. Now the narrow strip of Upper Egypt and the wider fertile belt of Lower Egypt, the Delta, would work together. The benefits were immediate. The king who achieved this is thought to have been called Narmer. Here he is on a pallet, a sort of plate for offerings to the gods. Below him, the uniting of the two kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt, the cooperation on which all the future prosperity of Egypt depended, is symbolized by the intersecting necks of these two monsters. This side is still rather voodooish, but the other side, depicting King Narmer, is clear and orderly, and already shows some of the characteristics of Egyptian art, especially the way in which the heads are turned in profile and the chests are frontal. "1,500 years later, the Egyptians were still commemorating the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, even as far south as Abu Simbel. The figures representing the two regions are binding together the lungs, the organs vital for life, and rightly so. Whenever the unity was threatened by the breakdown of central government, Egypt suffered. No transport, no building, no productive human life was possible without the Nile, and it has remained the center of life for the Egyptian peasant. Insofar as civilization is the triumph of stability over vicissitude, of order over chaos, and of confidence in renewal, the Nile was the perfect setting for its birth. Soon after 3000 BC, a new capital was established near the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt. We refer to it by its Greek name, Memphis. Well, Memphis was repeatedly sacked and destroyed. Nothing to be seen now but palm trees. But a few miles away, on the first shelf of the desert, a king named Zoser built a royal retreat, half temple, half a place for peaceful rites and pleasure. And in the middle of it, he built as his tomb the earliest pyramid. This is Saqqara, to my mind, one of the sacred places of the world, the real birthplace of civilization. First thing that strikes one about Saqqara is its lightness and clarity. It's built of an exquisite creamy golden limestone. It's the earliest stone building in the world. The cutting is of such perfection, never equaled in Greece or Rome. And the strange thing is that it's an imitation in stone of wooden architecture, even down to imitating in stone the ends of wooden beams. They wanted to make something permanent. This is the entrance, but the whole area of the sacred enclosure is surrounded by a wall in the same style, made of the same beautifully dressed and fitted stone. The love of perfection could not go further. Of course, there have been restorations, and to see what the original building was like, one must look at some sarcophagi of the same date, which reproduce ideal architecture. What a refined, sophisticated style, very far from our idea of what ruins or primitive architecture should be, very far from Stonehenge, which was built considerably later. One can say that this row of pillars through which I'm walking is based on clusters of stems, but at the other end of the courtyard they turn into fluted columns, Doric columns, 2,000 years earlier than the Parthenon, except that they haven't disengaged themselves from the wall. Even the details that anticipate what we think of as an Egyptian style have a refinement that we might call classical. The oddest buildings of all are those that run along the north side of the court in which sacred festivals were held. What can they have been for? Were they little chapels? They're difficult to enter, and when one gets inside, there's a blank wall. But they have fluted columns of the utmost elegance, which lead up to capitals with holes for flagstaffs. One is completely baffled by the extreme sophistication and the incalculable purpose of this exquisite architecture. Combination of measuring mind and responsive hand cannot go further. The date, 2770 BC. Only a little of the precious outer covering of hewn stone remains on the pyramid, and the inner core's crumbled, so that it does look more barbaric. It's the earliest pyramid. Before that time, men have been buried in relatively modest tombs, and why King Zoser wanted to raise a pyramid of solid stone, we simply don't know. Deep underground in a tunnel nearby, there is a relief of King Zoser running a ritual race, a pose that was to survive all the way through Egyptian art for 3,000 years. Only it was more usually associated with victory than with religious ecstasy. In prehistoric times, kings had run an annual course to prove their continuing energy to rule, and this test may have survived as a ceremony. It has a glorious energy and elasticity. These people had a long run ahead of them. Zoser's body must have been in the tomb, which has been robbed, like every other royal tomb but one, but his likeness has come down to us in this little stone box. Battered but grandiose. The man who dominates Saqqara is not King Zoser, but a mysterious, haunting character named Imhotep. According to Egyptian legend, he was a sort of Prometheus, the first student of medicine, the first student of geometry, the first architect. Well, a fairly evolved architecture of brick and wattle did exist before his time. We can still see what it must have been like in contemporary dwellings very close to here. But Imhotep may have been, no, must have been, the first man to build in stone. No doubt he was a pioneer, and a universal man of almost legendary stature, a sort of Egyptian Leonardo da Vinci. He was buried at Saqqara, and recent excavators have found some posthumous likenesses of him. It's just conceivable that they may find his tomb. It should then become a place of pilgrimage for the whole civilized human race. It's in other tombs around Saqqara that almost all the finest works of art of the Old Kingdom have been found. These tombs were built to commemorate noblemen who were usually shown as a statue in a false entrance inside. And on the surrounding walls are scenes depicting human activity in a way that we hardly find again to the 15th century books of hours, or even Bruegel. As in a medieval calendar of the months, we can follow the seasons of the farmer's year. Asses tread in the seed. There's the standard method of sowing in the rich damp soil of the delta. Harvesting. The scythes would have been stone blades. We're still in the Stone Age. The crop is loaded into rope baskets. The Nile had made Egypt the greatest wheat-producing country of the ancient world. The other source of natural wealth was gold. It was mined in the eastern desert and was one of the first metals to be worked. Here are artisans blowing down hollow reeds to keep the charcoal furnace at the right temperature for smelting the gold. The craftsmen who worked on the gold collars and jeweled headdresses were chosen for their grotesque size, either very tall or dwarfish, so that if they tried to steal or run away, they could easily be identified. These reliefs are also full of vitality. On a Nile boat, the boatmen were obviously as rowdy as Thames bargees. With what energy and zest the artist has portrayed this local brawl. In addition to their extraordinary record of human activity, these tombs also show us something very important about the early Egyptians, their love of animals and of nature generally. They show all the stages of animal husbandry. A bearded farmer helps in the birth of a calf. Cattle are driven across the river, while the herders keep an anxious lookout for lurking crocodiles. Among the tall reeds of the swamps, a small boy fishes, oblivious of the drama of the hippopotamus hunt at the other end of the boat. The Greek historian Herodotus, when he visited Egypt long after its days of imperial greatness, in fact at about the year 450 BC, was amazed at the Egyptian feeling for animals. They didn't seem to think of them as a separate species to men. Very shocking to a Greek. And he tells how, when a house is on fire, the first thing the Egyptians do is to save the cats. They hand them from one person to another while the house burns down. In all this there may be some element of totemism, but totemism alone doesn't account for their amazing curiosity about different kinds of birds and fishes. There are said to be 18 kinds of bird and 15 kinds of fishes represented in the tomb of Ti. Nor does it explain the delicate sympathy with which every species is observed. From these reliefs, we know more about life in ancient Egypt than we do about any other early society, because the Egyptians were, from the first, a profoundly visual people. In Egypt, one is tempted to paraphrase the opening words of St. John's Gospel and say, "In the beginning was the image, and the image was with God, and the image was God." Even their writing consisted in a series of visual experiences, pictograms that turned into letters, consonants only, there were no vowels. These beautiful little images must be the most uneconomical form of writing ever invented, even more so than the Chinese ideogram, and sooner or later they were superseded by two simpler forms of script. Very early they came to be recorded on another Egyptian invention, papyrus. The papyrus plant grew all along the Nile in ancient times. Its tough stems are often 10 feet in height. The Egyptians cut them into strips like this, soaked them, dried them, and simply pressed them together in a crisscross pattern. No other adhesive was used. One can see the crisscrossing of the strips if one holds up a piece of papyrus to the light. There it is. The result was an extremely tough and durable form of writing material. Much of it has survived. Here's an example. Papyrus was used all over the Mediterranean world for more than 2,000 years until the Chinese invention of paper superseded it. The Egyptians continued to use the carved hieroglyphs for all ceremonial inscriptions. And, like Chinese calligraphy, they are a beautiful form of decoration. Only, unlike Chinese calligraphy, they are always the same. And they don't allow for individual expression. Because their script consisted of stereotyped images, the Egyptians could not achieve verbal abstraction. So they never created a philosophy in the Greek sense of the word. They could not speculate on the meaning of words. But one can't say that they were unable to form concepts, because all their visual experience was subjected to strict underlying form and geometrical schemes. The pyramids. They've got Egypt a bad name. You remember pictures in the children's encyclopedia of hundreds of slaves pulling huge blocks under the lash of a brazier. It is possibly true, as Herodotus counts, that the Great Pyramid demanded the labor of 100,000 men for 20 years. But the blocks floated up to the site during the flooding of the Nile, and these men were not slaves or prisoners. We even know what they were paid. The whole exercise may well have been undertaken in an almost devotional spirit, like building a great medieval cathedral, a monument to their god-king. According to Petrie, some of the masonry is so fine, the blocks weighing many tons are set together with seams showing a joint 1/1000th of an inch, equal to opticians' work of the present day. but on a scale of acres instead of inches of material. The blocks were cut by bronze saws with diamond edges, and the Great Pyramid consists of 2,300,000 blocks. Napoleon, when he saw it, calculated that with the stones of the 3 pyramids, he could build a wall 10 feet high and a foot wide all round France. For nearly 4,000 years, until the 19th century, the Great Pyramid was the tallest building in the world. Well, in the end it does seem somewhat unimaginative to devote so much labor to mere size. They look like brutal assertions of power until one sees them. Then one realizes that these vast exhibitions of solid geometry were perhaps the only things that could hold their own at the junction of cultivated Egypt and the annihilating desert that stretches interminably to the west. I don't suppose that its builder, Kafur, commonly known as Cheops, thought of it in that light. He thought of it partly as an assertion of power, and partly as a safe resting place for his body, which unfortunately it was not, because Egyptian tomb robbers had more time and quite as much expertise as modern safe breakers. And he also thought of it, as did his subjects, as an indestructible assertion of faith. And this it has proved to be. The pyramids, which the poet Blake thought of as the essence of materialism, are in their way religious buildings. Religious also is that other familiar image that crouches in front of them, the Sphinx. For centuries it was hidden under the sand. It isn't even mentioned by the Greek historian Herodotus. When it was discovered by Napoleon's expedition, it was restored, and the nose fell off. The nose is in the British Museum. Subsequent restorations have made things worse. It's a god and not a pharaoh, but which god we do not know. The sculpture of 2500 BC shows the same confidence and energy that went to build the pyramids. When I look at small children hopping and bouncing, I think, that's got to last them 70 years. The energy of the old kingdom lasted 700. In this group, the pharaoh Mykerinus is accompanied by 2 female figures, a goddess named Hathor and the embodiment of a province called a nome, who was important because the administration of Egypt depended very much on regional government. In fact, regional autonomy was the cause of the growth of the old kingdom. Another group by the same sculptor shows Mykerinus and his wife. See, she is treated as his equal. The days when wives of the pharaohs were tiny figures at their feet are 1,000 years away. benevolent corporation. There's the same sense of a steady nerve prime minister and inspector of buildings. He is modern man, with all his subtlety and complexity. The figures in Boston, and during the last war, when the Americans feared a bomb attack, the director of the museum, before putting him into the vaults, dressed him in modern clothes and had him photographed to show that man had not changed much in 4,500 years. The village mayor, found in the tomb of Ka Appa at Saqqara, is a little more localized to the eastern Mediterranean. You might interview him in his Cairo office today, and you might meet the rather odious Prince Ra-Hotep in the streets. Even the famous scribe in the Louvre, although more idealized, is an individual portrait. And here I may digress to say that the word scribe is misleading. This was the accepted way of representing a civil servant. And the large number of figures in this pose is an indication of the vast importance of the bureaucracy in early Egypt. The early Egyptian interest in humanity was not confined to counselors and civil servants. From almost the first, they began to do small figures of ordinary people at work. Here are two of the first. And you see that, as well as being beautiful pieces of small sculpture, they show a touching sensibility to the character of the actual workers. In the ancient world, this response to ordinary working people is uniquely Egyptian. One wouldn't expect to find it in Babylonian or Syrian art, but it doesn't exist in Greece either. Working people were slaves whose activities were not worth recording, except as comic characters in drama. However, I must admit that the grandest and most confident of all Egyptian portraits goes a little further. This portrait of Pharaoh Khephren must be the noblest effigy of a ruler ever made. This feeling of composure and indestructible self-confidence lasted 700 years, much longer than the Roman Empire. Then there was a social revolution, darkness and destruction, which, to judge from the few surviving documents, seems to have been like the Dark Ages in Western Europe. The lights came on again in the period known as the Middle Kingdom, but Egypt had lost some of its confidence. The portraits of the pharaohs become more thoughtful. They show a vie intérieure, a discovery of melancholy, of the burden of the soul, very different from the bouncing heartiness of the old kingdom. Ra, the simple extrovert god of the sun, becomes less representative than Osiris, god who was murdered by his brother and resurrected, the god who presided over the dead. Egypt once more established a great empire, but one sees in this little chapel of Sesostris how much more complex and tender was Pharaoh's relationship with the gods. Almost every relief shows Sesostris drawing inspiration and spiritual strength from the physical potency of the god. And above the reliefs are these panels of the most beautiful hieroglyphics. I think almost the most beautiful of the whole of Egyptian art. These reliefs also show what was to become one of the most life-enhancing achievements of Egyptian art, the cult of physical beauty. This Middle Kingdom lady is already a sort of Mona Lisa, only more appealing to our eyes. And a little later, my goodness, what beauties. These men and girls in the tomb of Ramose are actually early New Kingdom, but they are descended from almost equally beautiful grandmothers. Was there ever such elegance and refinement? Perhaps in the Kore of 6th century Greece, or among the Gothic Madonnas. And the longer you look at them, the more you realize that, like the Greek Kore, they're all subtly different from one another. The anxiety that one sees in the portraits of the Middle Kingdom was justified. Egyptian civilization collapsed again, this time from external invasion, and once more renewed itself. A series of warrior pharaohs adopting the new weapon of the chariot drove out the invaders and established a great empire. This was the so-called New Kingdom, new in the year 1590 BC. It's not as creative, nor as human as the Old Kingdom, but architecture reached new heights of magnificence. This is Hatshepsut's temple in the hills near Thebes. It's worth remembering that this is at the same date as the ferocious beginnings of Chinese art. Before these pillars, one can't help exclaiming once more, how Greek. It's over 1,000 years before the Parthenon. But in 1378 BC, there took place the strangest incident in Egyptian history, the reign of the man who came to be known as Akhenaten and who changed the state religion. There are two conflicting types of portrait of Akhenaten. This one, a sensitive, intelligent face like a Botticelli, or perhaps the death mask of Keats. The other, more idiosyncratic, a long, attenuated head where the sensitivity borders on neurasthenia. And he still excites conflicting feelings, Some Egyptologists call him an overrated crank or fanatic. Others call him a religious genius and the first individual in history. I think the last proposition is true. He was determined to bring Egypt back to the worship of a single god, which he believed had been the practice of the Old Kingdom. The god was called Ra-Aten, the sun, and there was already a considerable following for his worship in Heliopolis. But Akhenaten did it with a passionate single-mindedness that very seldom works in public affairs. He built a new capital of the empire and called it Akhenaten, and he gave up his life and that of his beautiful and intelligent queen Nefertiti to worshipping the sun. The large ritualistic figures of him, like this one in Cairo, made older historians speak of him as a misshapen epileptic. And I confess it is rather disturbing. I think it must contain some part of the truth, because these wonderful sculpture sketches of him suggest the same kind of quasi-hysterical face. There must have been some genetic oddity, because his daughters, whose likenesses we know from these exquisite small sculpture sketches, have the same very odd-shaped heads. Incidentally, Akhenaten was one of the very few pharaohs whose parents were not related. But his wife, Nefertiti, was never caricatured in this way, and remains the most beautiful woman who has come down to us from the past. Whatever else his religious convictions may have done, they had a liberating effect on art. He allowed himself and his family to be portrayed with unprecedented intimacy. Here he is embracing one of his daughters, far from the formal pose of a pharaoh. After his death, although craftsmanship remained unsurpassed, this is his daughter and son-in-law Tutankhamun, inspiration vanished, along with the worship of the single god. Akhenaten was also a poet whose hymn to the sun has come down to us in an inscription. It has an astonishing likeness to the hymn to the sun by the greatest religious genius of medieval Christianity, St. Francis. Bright is the earth when thou risest in the horizon, all trees and plants flourish. The birds flutter in their marshes, their wings uplifted in adoration of thee. The sheep dance upon their feet, all winged things fly, they live when thou hast shone upon them. The chicklet crieth in the eggshell, thou givest him breath therein to preserve him alive. When thou hast perfected him, that he may pierce the egg, he cometh forth to chirp with all his might. O Lord, how manifold are thy works! In wisdom thou hast made them all. The earth is full of thy creatures. That last versicle is from the 104th Psalm, but it is almost word for word the same as some other lines in Akhenaten's hymn. And of course, it raises the question whether the monotheism of Akhenaten could be the origin of the monotheism of the Jews. Unfortunately, the captivity of Israel in Egypt, which is the linchpin of Jewish history and religion, seems to have left no impression at all on the Egyptians. No mention of a Semitic vizier called Joseph, no mention of the 10 plagues, no mention of Moses, not even a hint. We can't guess to within 500 years when the whole episode took place. The first indisputable mention of Israel in an Egyptian document occurs just over 1,000 years after the death of Akhenaten. It is tempting to believe that the Jews took Akhenaten's monotheism with them to the desert of Sinai, and thus that the spiritual enlightenment of Akhenaten that failed so disastrously in his own country was ultimately to become the faith of the Western world and of Islam. But I fear that it's no more than a historian's dream. And in fact, the greater part of Judaic literature is far more Mesopotamian in spirit than Egyptian. Akhenaten's experiment was bound to fail. The Egyptian empire was overstretched and needed a man of action to defend it. Previous pharaohs had kept their positions by balancing the powers of the army and the priesthood, and Akhenaten had defended them both. They managed to get rid of him. Exactly how, we don't know. They razed his capital to the ground and moved the court back to Thebes, the great center of the cult of Amun. There followed the great centuries of Egyptian imperialism. The three pharaohs called Ramesses were warriors and conquerors. In a sense, the creative element of Egyptian civilization was lost. Imperialism involves uniformity, bureaucracy, military castes, all the things that are hostile to original genius. We've reached the age of gigantic temples. This is the entrance to the Luxor temple with its inevitable obelisk, one of a pair which the other is in the Place de la Concorde. The great courtyard is really one of the most beautiful pieces of Egyptian architecture. It is considerably bigger than any European cathedral, but it's quite small and modest compared with the gigantic complex of Karnak. What a place. As one walks between these serried rows of rams, much too close together, and approaches the enormous entrance, one feels alternately crushed and elated. The Hall of Columns is one of the wonders of the world, but no camera can give any idea of its size and complexity. It's said that over 100 men can stand on the top of each of these pillars. There are 122 of these enormous columns, with 12 even bigger ones down the middle, about 70 feet high. And how thick? Well, you can see when I try to put my hands around them. We are told that the whole of Canterbury Cathedral could be fitted into this single hall. Originally, the columns were rough, like the two-end ones, but they were smooth and faced with a stone which allowed for a special kind of relief carving with a deep incision all round the outlines to give them carrying power. These reliefs are, for the most part, very able pieces of sculpture. No more than able, impressive by their combination of energy and a sense of beauty. The dominant sweep of Ramesses II's shoulder, contrasting with his crown, is a splendid, vigorous, formal invention. And what a classical beauty he is. And yet, after an hour or two, these reliefs become exhausting, even oppressive. And after walking around the whole enormous area, one begins to feel, oh, not another relief, for Pete's sake. The reason? Because they are propaganda, repeated as relentlessly as propaganda in Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Russia, although with a good deal more art. If repetition was the essence of propaganda, they certainly achieve it. And Ramesses' propaganda image spread everywhere, even as far as Abu Simbel. One could call Ramesses II the Napoleon of Egypt, the insatiable conqueror obsessed by la gloire. His tomb has been rifled as usual. Only his mummy was left, and as you see, he lived a good deal longer than Napoleon, almost as long as Mr. Rockefeller. He built himself a funerary temple, considerably larger and grander than Napoleon's tomb in Les Invalides. It contains some magnificent fragments and the usual reliefs, and one of these shows Ramesses the Conqueror with his horse-drawn chariots causing indescribable confusion in the enemy. One looks at it without much sympathy. And then one turns one's head and sees this gigantic figure fallen to the ground, but still majestic. Here's the shoulder, and over there is the ruined head. The whole thing is said to have weighed over 1,000 tons. And walking round it, one realizes what an amazing sense of form the Egyptian sculptors retained even in this age of authoritarianism. One mightn't have liked the figure so much when it was standing upright. On its side, it's a magnificent piece of abstract sculpture. Well, eventually the tide of history turned and swallowed Egypt, as it has done all civilizations. Is there anything for us to learn from it besides the nostalgic pleasure of looking at these great ruins? I think there is. I'm standing between two of the most famous monuments of Egyptian art, the so-called Colossi of Memnon. Every early traveler visited them, including the Emperor Hadrian, who had a eulogy inscribed on one of their knees. Throughout all these centuries, the colossi used to rise out of green grass. When I first saw them, there were little black goats skipping round them in the grass. Now, the famous high dam, built out of the noblest motives, has prevented the Nile from carrying down its silt, so instead of grass there is mud. The double-edged sword of technology has ruined a natural process that had worked perfectly for 5,000 years. Surely there is a lesson for us in this. The long triumph of Egypt depended on her respect for the natural order of things, the yearly return of the life-giving waters of the Nile. The civilization of the Old Kingdom was based on renewal, the husbanding of nature, not, as ours has been, on a greedy expansion and exploitation of resources. Nowadays we're told that it's discreditable to look backwards and try to find inspiration in the arts and beliefs and moral standards of the past. We're told that man has changed. Well, he hasn't. And nor has woman. Technology, although it may ruin us, is not going to remove our deep-seated need for order and harmony, or the feeling of sympathy for our fellow creatures, both human and animal, or the belief, for which we have no rational grounds, that some part of us is immortal. These ideas first found expression 5,000 years ago. And even if they are lost for a time, we can renew them, as the Egyptians did.